So very often I always point people to the Financial Times. The Financial Times has consistently delivered and been one of the only papers that has generally delivered good and accurate reporting of what the hell is going on in this Brexit mess. And you've got an opinion piece in the Times today from a guy called Robert, how do you say this? Shimpsley? I hope that's how you say it. But anyway, from Robert. I'll leave a link to it down below. And this is what I have been talking about for so long. So, Brexit is teaching Britain its true place in the world. Politicians and voters alike have nourished delusions about the nation's global role. What have I been saying for the past 2 years? That this entire delusion that Brexiteers have has been based on this fantasy idea that somehow Britain, this is going to become this global trading powerhouse. It's not. It's just flatly not going to happen, because it's based on the British Empire, where we had all these colonies around the world, where we had the largest navy in the world, a time when we didn't sign trade deals, we just turned up on someone's doorstep with a battleship and said, open your ports to our merchants and accept these terms or else. And if you didn't accept these terms, they'd probably shell the port. And then the British Army would turn up, and then they would install a ruler who was more favourable to accepting those terms. Or they would just take the place completely outright and it would become a colony. So, in one sense, Boris Johnson is right. The Brexit process has indeed felt like a national humiliation. How many Brits have felt our innards shrivel at key moments of the negotiations? And I am not talking about the unwarranted Second World War references and Dad's Army considerations. I am talking about the parts of the process that haven't gone as predicted. Perhaps we should take a step back from the bloviated rhetoric. Humiliation is too strong, and national humbling is more accurate. The philosophy of Brexit was that, freed from EU constraints, the UK would take its rightful place in the world. This is indeed what is happening, but alas, that place is not as a great power of their imagination, but the UK's place in the world is hardly terrible. But as Mr. Johnson learnt during his brief but undistinguished term as Foreign Secretary, our emissaries are no longer bestride summits like colossuses. For far too long, British politicians, journalists and voters have enjoyed a partly distorted vision of the nation as an indispensable world player. Now the nation is facing the painful truth that the UK is not as preeminent as it has liked to believe. For proof, look at the negotiations over the Irish border. One needed not to get into the rights and wrongs to see that the UK has essentially been pushed around by Ireland, because the EU has thrown its weight behind the demands of its continuing member. The hard fact is that the power imbalance has meant the UK is being forced to choose between the chaos of a no-deal Brexit or the undermining of the constitutional integrity of one of its 4 sovereign parts, and signing up to a significant amount of rule-taking. This is what happens when a single country that is not America or China negotiates with a global trading bloc. From the sequence of negotiations to the empty scorecard of British wins, the entire process has been a lesson in power politics. Few who saw the TV programme on America's London Embassy will forget the smirks as US officials described the British Brexit delusions. They sort of see it as a negotiation between 2 equal parties. One should not overstate this. Britain is not Latvia. it still carries heft. It is a top 10 global economy, 6th, 5th or 9th depending on your market of choice, but it remains a military power, with a nuclear deterrent and a seat on the UN Security Council. It is the only European nation with access to US intelligence through the Five Eyes programme. Its preeminence as a financial centre will not immediately be displaced by Brexit. The UK will still get its call, but after France and Germany, just before Canada, life in the top 10 is different to life in the top 3. Much of the UK's global clout was delivered from being one of the big nations in the EU. Margaret Thatcher used that very platform to help create the single market, to drive forward global trade and entrench democracy in Eastern Europe. The 1970s champions of British membership were right in arguing that the alternative to pooled sovereignty was not more influence, but less. Now Britain is about to taste life as one of the loudest of the next level voices in this tier. Maintaining influence beyond military matters requires the painstaking, unbombastic alliance building that saw its existing political and diplomatic predations so described as sellouts by our chauvinistic MPs and media. It might, for example, mere expending entry permits for Moldova trade representatives, so they do not delay the UK's ambitions at the World Trade Organization. So, and how will the UK's status be reflected in its new trade deals? One only has to look at Donald Trump's treatment of Canada to see that his negotiators will offer no special favours to the UK. Mr. Trump is pro-Brexit because he wants to see a weakened EU not play benefactor to the UK. EU nationals will be EU nations will be similarly cutthroat, nor will the sentimental attachments affect Commonwealth nations. Too many Brits fail to grasp that former colonies do not look back to the empire with any affection. While this has been understood by serious figures in government, too much of Britain's political culture and its self-image have been driven by its colonial past and the national myths built up around the last war. This is why Brexiteers cling desperately to the theory that Theresa May has betrayed Brexit. The alternative is to accept that it is their own reckless arrogance that has reduced the UK to the role of supplicant with its former partners. Adjusting to the reduced status will require a reality check in our media and our politics and a touch of humility. If Brexit helps the UK to become a more accurate realisation of its global significance, some good may yet come out of this wretched business. Still, it seems an expensive way to learn a lesson. And I agree completely. I agree 100% with what Robert said in that article. This is what I've been saying for so long. Our entire cultural and myth around is built on the idea of empire. All these Brexiteers are steeped in this mythical Britain that hasn't existed for well over 100 years and is not going to come back just because we leave the EU. The world has changed. We are not an empire anymore. And what it takes for people to get through that to their heads, and the idea, as we have discussed many times on this channel before, that that the Commonwealth countries are going to somehow turn around and just embrace us, is completely false. They do not like us because of how we treated them when we were their colonial masters. This is not going to be a simple negotiation of India. Any negotiation we enter into India, they automatically have us over a barrel because we are so desperate. no trade deal, and this was discussed only a couple of weeks ago. There was this big argument on LBC with Ian Dunt and two of the idiot Brexiteers on that panel. Ian Dunt and I think it was Adonis basically said, look, you cannot replicate the trade we are going to lose from the EU by doing a trade deal with Australia that's around the world. That is not how trade works. Trade is always a matter of geography, not historical ties. We will always be, and our closest trade links will always be with Europe. And you see this in the complete folly where you had Dominic Raab come out and say, oh yes, I didn't understand the importance of the Dover-Calais crossing. So this is where we are. And it's good because at least a lot of people do understand. But there are a lot of people out there who are culturally brought up in the myth. I mean, if you remember when we went back and we read some of the comments from the Yorkshire Post, how many of those comments were all about, ooh, Germany, ooh, this will be a game of, one-upmanship. And he's just like, no, this is not Germany we are negotiating with. It's 27 other countries that are clubbed together to form an economic bloc. And the reason why they are more shifting to the EU Parliament and why these exist to create rules and regulations has all been around trade, and that basically people get a fair deal when they go to work in another country so that they're not exploited. It's hilarious when you see Brexiteers come out and say, oh, all these EU nationals are getting a lower wage. You do know there is a thing such as the national minimum wage, right, guys? But it really is, it's so disheartening, but it's so good to see that, yeah, when I've been saying that for years, there is now a guy in the Financial Times who just goes, yeah. And it's so heartening to see. It really is. Brings a smile to my face.